Welcome to this talk on investigative journalism and national security, hosted by Human International Documentary Film Festival in collaboration with Fritt. We are talking today with Ben Weissner, director of ACLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project. He has been the main legal advisor for whistleblower Edward Snowden since 2013 and works a lot with the intersection between civil liberties and national securities. Welcome, Ben. Great to have
Thank you so much.
Here.
I'm glad to be here, and I want to say also thank you to the Film Festival and to Fritt, which has been a wonderful supporter of the ACLU.
And we talked about ACLU. It's an institution in the US, but not everybody in Europe or Norway or elsewhere knows what kind of organization it is. Could you just briefly explain?
Sure, very briefly. The ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union. It has been in existence for now over 100 years, so it's the oldest and largest civil liberties and human rights organization in the United States, but it works only domestically, not generally internationally. And our role is to protect constitutional and individual rights largely from encroachments and violations by the government. And so regardless of what government is in power, you can be sure that the ACLU is going to be a needle poking at them in some way. But obviously that was quite dramatic under the Trump administration, where we filed hundreds of legal actions against Trump.
And we'll come back to your work a bit during the Trump administration. We are focusing today on the case of Julian Assange and the consequences that the charges against him can have for investigative journalism, particularly when it comes to national securities. And you have voiced some quite grave concerns. What are the charges there that makes you concerned about the future of investigative journalism?
Well, this is really an unprecedented prosecution in modern American history. Julian Assange has been charged under the Espionage Act of 1917, a very ominous sounding law that should be targeted at spies, but increasingly in recent years has been targeted at whistleblowers and journalistic sources. But this is the first time in the history of that act that someone has ever been criminally charged for publishing truthful information. And there are a number of charges against Assange. Some of them purport to charge him with conspiring with Chelsea Manning to hack government computers. But the core of the case is that the United States contends that it is a felony under US law for Assange and WikiLeaks to have published US secrets on its platforms. And of course, publishing government secrets is precisely the job description of a national security investigative journalist. The job of a effective national security journalist is to persuade people in positions of privilege to, against the law, disclose information to the public in the public interest. And if you look at the modern history of the United States and imagine what the public never would have known but for journalists who published the government secrets, we would not have known that the US was engaged in a torture conspiracy, that it set up secret prisons around the world and had an extraordinary rendition program. We wouldn't have known the scope of the US drone wars. We wouldn't have known that there was a global system of mass surveillance that was implemented without the consent of the public. All of these stories came to light because someone in government handed over information to journalists who then shared it with the public and changed the law and changed the world. These charges against Assange, whatever you think of him, and we will get to that, put those activities within the scope of criminal law, and that is immensely dangerous.
And you're saying he's being prosecuted for publishing truthful facts, truthful information. But is there also a legitimate reason for governments to keep national security information secret? I mean, and how do you balance that with a democratic need to also be able to expose some of that information?
So I do think that's an important starting point for this conversation, which is I am very willing to acknowledge that there are legitimate government secrets. Most people in this conversation, most journalists believe that there are legitimate government secrets. No journalist wants to publish the name of an undercover operative who is working in harm's way and might be killed because of the story. No journalist, if they had found out that the U.S. Navy SEALs were about to raid bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, would have published that 6 hours in advance and thrown that mission into disarray. So there are clearly legitimate secrets. Now, by the same measure, most governments classify and keep secret much more information than they should. I'm most familiar with the US, but I doubt that 5% of what's classified is legitimately classified, in my view. That is that its disclosure would really cause harm to the security of the nation. Most information is classified out of habit to protect embarrassment, and just because that's the way that these kinds of agencies operate. So the more difficult and more interesting question is not whether there are some legitimate secrets, but who should decide where to draw the line between what the public needs to know to have a functioning democracy and what the state needs to conceal in order to have a national defense. Now, governments would tell you, especially in democracies, governments would tell you that they themselves are the only legitimate actors to draw these lines. After all, they were elected by the public. They were given this power and this trust by the public. But of course, that's a circular argument, because if the president of the United States gets to decide what I know about him, then the president can conceal information that might lead me to vote against him. And then how can you say that I've given him the authority to make this decision on my behalf? And in fact, we know the way that classification is abused, which is to protect political leaders from embarrassment. So it can't be the answer to the question that the democratically elected leader of a country gets to decide by himself or herself what the public should see. And so sort of into this conundrum, we have the profession of journalism, which kind of mediates between governments and the public. And does so in the public interest. And if you speak to journalists who practice in this space, their goal is not to overthrow governments. Their goal is to protect democracy and give the citizens the information they need in order to hold their own leaders accountable, while at the same time protecting government secrets where that is appropriate. And in virtually every country where this kind of journalism is practiced, when journalists obtain government secrets, they tend to enter into conversations with government actors before they just go and publish it in their newspapers to see whether there's something they might have missed. But they don't give governments veto power over what the public needs to know about how the government is operating.
But isn't that exactly part of the problem here, that WikiLeaks didn't do, they didn't follow the journalistic tradition of, dialogue with the government. They just published everything.
It's hard to say what WikiLeaks practices have been because they've changed so much. In this case, Assange is being prosecuted for the Chelsea Manning leaks. And as you may recall, in that instance, WikiLeaks did in fact work with mainstream journalistic institutions to bring that information to the public. They did work with The Guardian, with Der Spiegel, and with the New York Times in order to bring that information forward. And those institutions, in fact, did engage with governments before publishing. It's true that since then, WikiLeaks has very much changed its model, no longer partners with those kinds of organizations, has been very critical of those organizations for redacting information. And in its recent publications, it has put whole data sets online in ways that those news organizations would not. I don't think that's what happened in the case that is now being prosecuted. But I do agree with you that in the modern world where we have so many new forms of publishing, we may not be able to rely in the same way on these professional ethical traditions of journalism that sort of see themselves as partners in the public interest, especially when you're dealing with an entity like WikiLeaks that sees it as part of its goal to undermine the US empire. It certainly doesn't see itself as a partner with the US government or even with the American public. And so that does put pressure on the old way of doing things. Nonetheless, I think bringing criminal charges against WikiLeaks here is a huge threat to all of the journalists who are working in that more traditional way.
And it's a huge threat to journalists in the US, but it can also affect investigative journalism elsewhere in the rest of the world.
Right, and let's talk about that for a few reasons. This may sound a little bit glib, but I really do sometimes describe effective investigative journalism as a criminal conspiracy, right? As we said before, what these journalists are essentially doing is trying to persuade other people to break the law with them in the public interest. And that is a really vital part of democratic oversight. And if you start making it a crime, and again, here we're not talking about the sources who turn over the information. There are problems with the laws that deal with them, but every country would criminalize people for handing over secrets. Here we're talking about publishing those secrets, publishing truthful information. If you set the precedent that that can be prosecuted, not only will that chill important investigative journalism in the US, but we've seen time and again how other countries will use the US conduct to justify what they're doing. And we've already seen other countries who are cracking down on reporters point to the US indictment of Assange and say, what's the difference? But there's another way that I think has not gotten as much attention, that this case is a global threat. And that is that the US is taking the position that a foreign publisher, remember Assange has no ties to the US, he was an Australian working out of Europe and elsewhere, that a foreign publisher is bound by US criminal secrecy laws, and that Julian Assange violated US law when he decided to publish US secrets. Well, we know that what journalists do routinely is publish the secrets of other countries. The New York Times in recent years has gotten troves of secret documents out of China about the Uyghur situation in Western China, out of Iran, and published important investigative journalism, because of course that kind of journalism would not take place in those countries. How would we react if countries around the world, if Turkey, if China, if Iran, if Hungary started to decide, we don't like what you published our secrets, it's against the law to publish our secrets, and therefore we are going to ask for your extradition or detain you if you're in the country. I think people would react with horror in the United States if that happened. But what would be the principled basis for objecting? I think the days when we could say, well, we have a great legal system and you have a terrible one, and that's enough of the difference. I think we've passed that. I think we've lost that credibility. Whatever credibility we had has been pretty damaged by our having elected someone like Donald Trump to the presidency. We don't have that kind of moral authority. So I worry very much about the US establishing the precedent that any country can apply its own secrecy laws extraterritorially to other countries' journalists.
Yeah, that sounds chilling. As a journalist myself, that's...
Well, and you've worked in many countries, right? You have practiced journalism around the world. Surely you have at least been adjacent to running afoul of some of those countries' laws. And you would want your own country to be able to say in no uncertain terms, what you are doing is unacceptable. This is journalism. There are baseline principles. And think about the damage that it does when it's the United States that is undermining that global principle. Yeah,
for sure. And we have seen in the United States an increased pressure also against whistleblowers these past 8, 10, 15 years maybe. And I remember Barack Obama got a lot of attention for being the president that went after the more whistleblowers than any other American president. And we were talking here wondering why, and what's your view on that development?
So I want to say this first for context. The law that is used to target these whistleblowers, the Espionage Act, is so broad. It essentially makes no distinction between providing information to the press in the public interest and selling it to a hostile government for personal profit. That the real question that we probably should be asking is, not why there have been more of these prosecutions recently, but why there have been so few in the course of American history, because the government really does have the authority. And I think the answer is that because there is so much overclassification and excessive secrecy in the US, it's always been understood that leaks to the press operate as a kind of safety valve. Every day you open American newspapers, and there is information that was leaked from government sources in violation of some law or rule. And so if we were going to enforce these laws with rigor, there would be hundreds or even thousands of cases every year, not 12 in the whole history of the country. So I think we need to be a little cautious about statistics here. I do think that one reason why we're seeing more activity now is just that technology has changed the game. It's made it possible for a Chelsea Manning or an Edward Snowden to remove information from the government at a scale that would have required a lot of resources before. And it's made it a lot easier for governments to catch people because of all the forensic trails that are left behind. And so I don't think that President Obama was ideologically more opposed to whistleblowing than George W. Bush, who came before him. I think these things are more a little bit of a function of technological developments.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen any impact on this in the US? I mean, are there fewer whistleblower cases? Do you see any consequences of this?
Well, I mean, I think the good news is we're continuing to see lots of important leaks to the press in the public interest. And we certainly saw, hundreds of them during the Trump administration. Information was leaking out in a way that had an impact on policy.
Yeah, I think it was leaking more than before, wasn't it?
I think it was. I think it was leaking from all levels of government, even from people who were in the room with Trump when important phone calls or conversations were taking place. And you would see a draft executive order before it was released would be leaked to the press and published. There would be a reaction to it, and then sometimes it would be changed. It was almost as if leaks to the press were replacing normal government internal reviews because that administration was so chaotic. So I do think that the public is still getting very important information about what is happening in government. So really, I think the Assange case is the one that is most likely to change that balance. Not because I think that the Biden administration will turn around and start bringing cases against the Washington Post or the New York Times, but because in every administration, when those entities are going to publish very embarrassing national security stories for the government, there are always high-level conversations with government agencies and the lawyers for the press. If the lawyers for the press know that behind the threatening words from government officials are new legal precedents that could actually be used to target those institutions, they're going to be much more cautious in a way that I think does not benefit the public. It's very difficult to find examples of news stories that actually cause the national security harm that the governments insisted that they would. The government uses the same language every time. If you publish this, it's going to cause grave and irreparable harm to the national security. And every time that turns out not to be the case. And so I think, if anything, the newspapers, the media should be leaning towards publishing more aggressively, not less aggressively. And that's why I worry about criminalizing those transactions.
Have you seen any effects on he's not prosecuted yet. We don't have a sentence yet. But have you seen any effect on the national security coverage in US journalism that you could connect to the Assange case, or is it too soon?
I don't think so. I don't think it may be, again, that if you spoke to some journalists, they would say that their publications have become more cautious just since those charges were filed. But I have not actually seen that evidence yet. And look, there's a long way to go before Julian Assange will be sitting in a US courtroom and held in a US prison. Remember that the judge in the United Kingdom denied extradition on the grounds that because of his mental health and because of the isolating conditions that he would be held in, it would be dangerous to extradite him to the United States. An extraordinary thing for an ally to say about the US, but I think quite true. Now the United States has chosen, at least for now, to appeal that decision and to continue to seek the extradition of Assange. But I can assure you that human rights organizations, press freedom groups, I hope the news organizations themselves in the US will be urging the Department of Justice in the US, both publicly and privately, to find a way not to pursue this case because of the harms that it would do.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you about that. There's been, of course, some debate here in Norway as well. There's been human rights organizations getting engaged, press organizations getting engaged. But overall, I think the level of debate has been quite... it hasn't been very loud and very clear, at least. And I know people are like asking, like, why are we not protesting?
Part of the problem is Assange himself. And let's be candid, he's not very popular in our societies. Speaking from the US perspective, right, the Republicans on the right would like to see more prosecutions of journalists, so they are not particularly concerned about this. The Democrats blame Assange for Trump being elected in 2016 because he published the hacked materials from Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee, and was having private conversations with Donald Trump Jr. in the last days of the 2016 election. So they certainly have no love for him. And so no one, or very few people in the US are feeling sympathetic towards Assange's plight. And I think there aren't that many people who engage in the kind of abstract thinking about what this case represents beyond the particular facts. And I think even among journalists, when you talk to journalists who are not national security investigative journalists, they say, we're not worried about this because what he does is really different than what we do. He's not really a journalist. Well, that's not actually the question. The question is, what happens when the government establishes the principle that you can be imprisoned for publishing government secrets? Whether you think Assange is a journalist or not is completely irrelevant to that legal question and to the precedent that it will set. And so in that sense, it's very clever to try to use a case like Assange to establish this precedent, because there isn't going to be that much pushback, because only people who are either right in the middle of the issue or whose job it is to think about precedents like mine are going to be passionately focused on this issue. And most people will probably be happy to see him get punished for reasons that are unrelated to the legal issue.
Mm-hmm. You touched upon it, but so how would you describe the debate in the U.S. About the Assange case? I mean, you're in the middle of it, of course, yourself. But... Yeah.
Look, the U.S. was so focused over the last year and a half on the presidential election. Mm-hmm. Since then, it's been focused on Trump's second impeachment. Now it's focused on coronavirus and COVID and vaccines. There has been very, very little attention paid to this case, except in very, very small circles. And so when the charges were filed against Assange, you did see it was not only human rights organizations who said this was a problem. It was the news organizations. It was the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, even Fox, right? Across the political spectrum, the media said this is a problem. But then they moved on to the next issue, and it's been quite hard to focus attention on this. It's possible that the upcoming confirmation hearings for senior leaders in the Department of Justice will be an opportunity to bring a little bit more focus onto this question. But again, also, as I said, it may be a couple of years before we see Assange in a U.S. courtroom, because I don't know how long the appeals process for an extradition takes in the U.K., but that case would eventually need to be heard by the High Court in the United Kingdom. And that's not going to happen very quickly. So there doesn't seem to be urgency in the U.S. debate about this case.
Mm-hmm. Now, Britain also has a lot on its plate right now. I don't think it's the top priority there. Right. How do you, who are in the middle of it, how do you work to increase awareness, or to start a debate, or you talk to journalists or media organizations to remind them of the urgency? Or
yeah, I think so. Look, it's not clear whether the right strategy in this case is to try to galvanize public outrage or to try to have quiet conversations with key decision makers behind the scenes about this case. And maybe it will involve something of both. But at this stage, we only use the tools we have. We can write opinion pieces in newspapers. We can get letters, which we did last week, signed by press freedom organizations and human rights organizations aimed at administration officials. But I'm not optimistic that this is going to rise to the level of being, one of the top issues of public debate in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you say both the Democrats and the Republicans dislike Assange, let's use that word. But have you gotten any signals from the Biden administration on how they plan to pursue this, or how they look at this dilemma that you have been talking about?
No, it's much too early. I think, look, they had a very early decision point. They could have, in February this month, they could have decided not to appeal the denial of extradition and just let the case die. But remember that the senior leaders of the Department of Justice have not even occupied their positions yet. So that would be a major decision to make, a huge policy shift to make. And so it's not surprising that they continue with the case. But I will actually make one point here that I think people forget. The Obama administration decided not to bring these charges. They did consider them. They convened a criminal grand jury. They investigated WikiLeaks and Assange for years. And then they reached the conclusion, the Department of Justice under Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General at the time, that the case was just too dangerous to bring. They had no love for Julian Assange, but they could not get over what they called the New York Times principle, which is, can we find a way to criminalize WikiLeaks conduct without also criminalizing the New York Times conduct? And so they made the decision not to do it. And so for that reason, some of us have been cautiously optimistic that there are going to be people in the Obama universe who are now around President Biden and who may have the same instincts. Of course, the difference is that now the Democratic Party, as I said, blames Assange for Trump. And so I think that extra animosity is going to make it harder to have some of those reasonable, principled conversations that would have been easier to have before.
But there is an opening there, at least.
I hope so. I do.
How would you say the investigative journalism in the U.S. under Trump, like the past 4 years, it's been an anomaly for all of us, I was going to say. But has it been weakened by there's been a lot of at least verbal threats against the journalists?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, because I think what people focused on so much was Trump's real disdain and hostility and threats towards the press. But I don't think you find very many reporters or news organizations in the United States who were intimidated by Trump. So maybe if you were a reporter covering one of his rallies and there were 15,000 screaming people who were pointing at you, that was quite threatening for sure, for the media to have to walk into that kind of environment. I don't know if you ever did that when you were in the... I have been one of those journalists
in the back of a Trump rally. It's quite, it is quite intimidating, actually.
But my guess is it didn't affect your coverage. And that certainly has been the case, that I think that journalists did quite a good job in exposing Trump policies, even Trump policies that were intended to be secret. So I do think that that in that way, journalism was quite healthy in the United States in the face of those really outrageous, kind of attacks coming from the government. Of course, we don't know what we don't know, and. Not being in one of those news organizations, I can't say whether they, felt chilled or intimidated and didn't publish the story because of that. But the public evidence seems to suggest that journalists did just fine covering the Trump administration.
And it's a bit on the side of what we're talking about, but I'm curious to hear your opinion about this, since this is also what you work with. But the Twitter decision to remove Donald Trump from Twitter, How has it affected the public debate in the US, and was that the right decision?
It's very funny, I have to say. Just imagining Trump wanting to tweet all day and being separated from his ability to communicate unmediated with the public. I know that's not a serious response. More seriously, many people had called on Twitter to remove Trump years earlier because clearly his conduct on the platform violated their code of conduct and terms of service. My view was different. My view was that seeing Trump as he actually is was a tremendous public value, and that it was important for the American people to see a version of Trump who was not mediated through public relations professionals. And getting to see his cruel, impulsive, caustic, ignorant, foolish side every day on Twitter, for all we know, may be the reason why 81 million people voted against him, by far the most number of votes ever cast against a president in the history of the country. Certainly, I can tell you that we used Trump's tweets in lawsuits against the Trump administration because they gave us evidence of Trump's motives when his lawyers were trying to pretend that he was not a bigot or a racist against Muslims, for example. So I do think that it was important for Twitter to allow Trump to maintain that platform even as he violated their rules. But I also very much understand the decision after January 6th and the events in the US Capitol to say, we've had enough of this. We don't want to be associated with him anymore. Of course, it's my job to say that rather than just applauding and thanking Twitter for some of the peace and quiet that we all now feel, we do need to keep in mind that it's probably not healthy for democracies in the long term for a few Silicon Valley oligarchs to have the unfettered discretion to decide who has access to the world's dominant speech platforms and what the proper boundaries of political debate will be. And you've already seen in the US, as soon as the Democrats took control, these companies are now changing their moderation policies to appease the people who are now in power. Rather than, again, just celebrating that, we should understand that they will change again when power changes again, and start thinking about what kinds of neutrality principles we want to be promoting over that kind of authority.
And there was, just to circle back to Julian Assange and your client, I guess, Edward Snowden, there was rumors about Trump pardoning the two of them, or at least Julian Assange. Was there any truth to those rumors? Because
Trump is Trump, anything is possible. And I suppose that he could make an impulsive decision. He certainly made many in the context of his pardons. I never thought it was particularly likely that this would happen. Definitely people around WikiLeaks thought that it was a real chance, and they worked very hard, both publicly and privately, to persuade Trump to make that decision. The irony is that it was actually the Trump administration that reversed the decision of the Obama administration and brought criminal charges against Assange.
Right. Yeah.
I think that the people around WikiLeaks thought that they would be better off under Trump than they would be under Hillary Clinton. And that turned out to be a miscalculation that is having a profound impact on everybody. With Snowden, look, I mean, he's been so publicly critical of Trump that knowing the kind of injured narcissist that Trump is, it seemed inconceivable that Trump would set that aside. And Snowden had many opportunities in the last weeks to change his public tone towards Trump, and he declined to do that. One time when he was being very critical of Putin and the Russian government on social media, I said to him, "Are you sure that's such a good idea?" And he said, "I didn't do any of this to make friends," right? So this is somebody who is not going to change his principles or his public tone in order to appease someone like Trump or even someone like Putin, who has the ability to cause him so much harm.
What is the status and future, I guess, of Edward Snowden now? I mean, do you talk to him on a regular basis? What's his strategy? How do you proceed?
Before we talk about his strategy, let's talk about his life for a minute. He and his wife had a baby son at the end of 2020 in late December. So they have a newborn at home, and they're struggling in the same way that many people are around the world, with winter, with COVID, with child rearing, with work. Because of travel restrictions around the world and the difficulty and the need to stay together, he did also announce that the family will be applying for Russian citizenship, which means that they will have citizenship in both the United States and in Russia, for ease of movement and staying together. Otherwise, his wife would have to return to the United States and would not be allowed back into Russia because of travel restrictions. His hope is still that he'll be able to return to the US someday, not as a felon, not to put on a jumpsuit and enter a prison and serve a sentence as a felon, but with some resolution that recognizes the public value of what he did. It's also possible that some country other than the United States will decide at some point that enough is enough, and that he should be able to live there in peace, so that his choices are not just Russia on the one hand and a US maximum security prison cell on the other hand, but maybe a third possibility. Look, he's still young. He was 29 years old when this began in 2013. So he has a lot of life ahead of him. He's not asking for sympathy in his exile. He's managed to use technology to stay involved in the public debate that he helped to launch. And rarely a week goes by when he's not giving public remarks somewhere in the world about these issues. I hope that people who are watching this, if they have not already read his book, will read his book, Permanent Record, which is published in Norwegian. But I think I would recommend that your audience read the book in English, because it's really beautiful in English. And it's a wonderful memoir of his life, but also, goes into detail about all the issues that we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. You recommend the book, but I was also going to ask you to recommend, since this is part of an international documentary festival, if you could recommend a couple of documentary films related to the topics that we have discussed.
Sure. Well, the most obvious recommendation is Citizen4. This was the documentary by Laura Poitras that won the Academy Award in the United States for Best Documentary. And it is quite remarkable, because when Edward Snowden met with the journalist Laura Poitras and Ewan McCaskill of The Guardian and Glenn Greenwald in a hotel room in Hong Kong, the camera was on. And we really get to see history firsthand. And you also get to see how careful and thoughtful Snowden was even at that time. I think many people think that, the Snowden that you see now, the polished public speaker, is a product of people like me who have, kind of trained him in how to speak like a human rights lawyer. But the importance of this film is that you get to see him before he met any of us. He had never spoken to a journalist or any lawyer. So I really recommend Citizen4. It's so compelling. On the WikiLeaks subject, and WikiLeaks itself is not happy with any of the documentaries that have been made about WikiLeaks, and they think that they are all defamatory. I actually think that if you watch some of these documentaries, Laura Poitras made one called Risk. Alex Gibney made one called We Steal Secrets. You actually get to see, especially in the early parts of these documentaries, why WikiLeaks was so compelling in 2009 and 2010 and 2011, why this sort of band of rascals that was taking on the global security state, why people like me were rooting for them so hard, right? After we had, experienced basically so much stonewalling over the years, so much excessive secrecy, so much impunity for human rights violations, to have this dashing Bond villain, come out and really hold their feet to the fire was thrilling, and it captures some of that thrill. But of course, these documentaries also show, some of the darker sides and some of what has gotten WikiLeaks into trouble in the years since then.
Part of the story too. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. We're all human beings.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good time to round off our discussion. Thank you so much, Ben Weissner, lawyer at the ACLU. And thank you for everybody who has been listening, watching. This talk was hosted by the Human International Documentary Film Festival in collaboration with Fritt. And enjoy the festival, everybody.